What's the most connected, non-sexual experience you've ever had with someone? My parents and my bio parents. My bio parents were neglectful and didn't know what they were doing, so I spent a lot of time with this other couple that was nearby. I kept spending more and more time there, until I transitioned into being a full-fledged member of the household. That line between being their son and some kid that hangs around all the time was subjective and kind of up to interpretation, but the first time they took me on vacation with them, that's when it was really settled. It wasn't even as though it was their huge generosity. It was just something that I was entitled to because I was part of their family. The expression that was made by that sealed it, and I'd call that something that connected us. When I was in high school, I had a friend over. His home life wasn't great and we would often stay up into the early hours playing Magic: The Gathering. My mom comes in the room we are hanging out in and starts being weird, needy, clingy, hostile, mostly drunk. After having put up with her alcoholism for 18 years, never saying a word, being strong for the family, something inside me breaks. I lay into her. The only time I've ever lashed out at my parents. Tell her that all the bad things that happen to her are because she drinks. It's not fair the rest of us have to put up with her, and it's not fair that I'm without a mom 50% of the time. At this point I'm about to cry. I can't let my friends see me break down any further, so at 4 AM I'm running down the street trying to get some privacy. After a few minutes I sit down and let it all out, screaming, crying, what have you. After I'm done, I get up to go home and see my friend waiting for me on the corner. As I make it to him, he puts his hand on my shoulder and says, "You good? Thanks bud. I wish we still hung out." This is exactly why I stopped drinking. Listening to my child get mad at my stupidity, and she says, "Dad, you're drunk." That single phrase scarred me a bit. It took a couple of months, but I haven't had a drink in a little over 3 weeks, and I have very little temptation now. My dad recently collapsed with what we later found out to be motor neuron, ALS, killing his airways and stopping him breathing. He was rushed into hospital and was in a coma in ICU with leads and wires and intubated, which was odd because he'd never been in hospital during my whole life. I'd never seen him frail and small before, never sick, never ill. He was invincible. Our whole family was there, but they told us to prepare for the worst. When my time came to go in and say goodbye, I just sat with him and just cried and talked, telling him that his garden was doing well and there were tadpoles in his pond this year, which I knew he'd be so excited about. I've never felt so connected in one moment to anyone in my whole life. For those interested, he pulled through the removal of the intubation and he's now back at home. He still has motor neuron and he's still invincible. He still has motor neuron and he's still invincible. Who's cutting onions again? Wishing you two all the happiness in the world. My two best friends and I have been through a lot together, but specifically what comes to mind is when I lived with one of them for a few months. It was a crappy apartment and we were both broke, and it was cold outside, and we would sleep in the same bed every night and cuddle and talk about everything. We would get coffee every morning together. We worked at the same place. She's basically my sister now. I was confused as to your gender. You started off male in the post, but by the end I'm pretty sure you're a grill. Unless you are a guy that likes to cuddle with your sister. Right after my dad died, I told my family and so that I needed some time alone. Went to a dive bar on the other side of town. It was about 12:30 PM. And told the bartender to line me up 5 shots. Guy a couple seats down said something along the line of, "Dang dude, that's a heck of a lunch. What's the issue?" Told him dad just died and I needed to take the edge off before I hopped a taxi back. I pointed at a handful of glasses he'd collected and asked what's up with him. He just said kid came out the wrong color. So we toasted to having crap days and parted ways once I was done. I saw him walking back into the hospital later with a bouquet of flowers. Hope everything turned out okay. All the hurting and you both still had the heart to talk to the other person about the problems. Either my wedding or the entire time with my best man that day and the day before the wedding. For I'd hope, pretty obvious reasons. My best man took care of me though leading up to it. I got an entire day's worth of bachelor party. He took me for a haircut the day of and made sure everything ran smooth. Hard to pick between finally tying the knot with the woman of your dreams and having your best friend have your back the whole time. I had recently went to a music festivals and was still wearing the wristband because I always forgot to cut it off. I was on the bus going to work and a guy who went to the same music festival as me grabbed my attention and we talked for the whole time as we headed into Manhattan. We exchanged numbers and he never contacted me back, but it was still a really great conversation. I enjoyed it. My first year of uni, I was pretty lonely sitting by myself on the lawn and doing a sketch for one of my classes, and a girl asked if she could sit next to me. We had an awesome 2-hour conversation and it felt like we were already friends. We exchanged numbers but never talked again, but it's kind of nice to think of that random stranger that brightened my day. I know this is already buried, but I'll tell it anyway. There was a mass shooting a block away from my house. A guy went into work and killed 7 people on a Friday afternoon. I was going to have people over that night, but the police had everything locked down and had set up a command post in front of my house, so my plans obviously were altered. I think the shooting started at about 430. It was about 830 and it had been a long 4 hours. The employees that were in the building that weren't hurt were eventually put on a city bus that was parked directly in front of my house. I remember sitting on my front steps and looking at the people in the bus and thinking what a horrible event they just went through. Lost in my thoughts, I realized I was staring at a young lady on the bus. When I realized it, I noticed she was doing the same thing back at me. I gave her a little "you're okay" smile and looked away. A few moments later I looked back in the bus and she was talking with an investigator. The investigator walked her out of the bus and over towards me. She asked if she could sit down next to me and I scooched over. She sat down next to me and held my hand, leaned on me and started to sob. I don't remember even saying anything and I don't think she did either. We just sat there for a few minutes until the investigator said she needed to go back on the bus. We hugged and she told me thank you. I never saw her again and don't even know her name, but at that moment I felt like I was meant to be there for her. I still think about her every once in a while and I hope she is well. Words cannot describe how awesome that is. Nice job. I was in the hospital, had been for about a week. My doctors told me to try and get up and walk around. I asked a nurse to take me for a walk and said I wanted to go outside. The hospital had a garden, so she took me out there. There was a little girl in a wheelchair looking at this little pond with a bench by it. I asked if I could sit and she said yes. We were quiet for a bit, then we had this conversation. Her, "You're sick too?" Me, "Yep." Her, "What's wrong?" Me, "My pancreas." You? Her, "Leukemia." Me, "I'm sorry. Does it hurt?" Her, "Sometimes. I get sick a lot." You? Me, "Same." Her, "I like to come out here and look at the ducks. Inside everyone is so worried, but to these ducks everything is fine. These ducks think everything is normal." Me, "Yeah, they can't really be bothered, can they? That'd be nice, not being bothered." Her, "Yeah." Then the nurse told me it was time for my medication, so I'd have to go back to my room. Never saw the girl again, but I think of her when I see ducks not giving a frick. This is straight out of a book. I'm a guy, and I was working with my female co-worker one night who I was close friends with. We were alone in the warehouse. Long story short, we both bent down to get something, and our heads bumped. We both looked up, faces close, and laughed it off. It was all so innocent and pure, and I'm so far from that, so it was a new experience. The old lady in the tramp moment. I met a girl a few years back while volunteering in Namibia. She was a volunteer as well, and we got along so well without any effort, having conversations about anything and everything for hours at times. After we left, we only had little contact over social media, but I met her again in London 2 years ago when she came for a weekend trip with some friends. And it was as if only a week went by. We talked for the entire evening without 10 seconds of silence at a time. Closest person to being something I'd call a soulmate. Anytime I get to sleep with someone, just sleeping, it can be the most intimate experience that you'll get for a long time. Human contact, affection when you've not had it in a very long time, for me over a year, is like finding a glass of water in a desert. The most connected, intimate, but non-sexual feeling was with my pen pal during all of my teen years. We never met in person, yet shared everything through copious correspondence. There was no limit, no roadblock, to the extent of our ability to express what each of us thought and experienced freely and without reservation. If it's possible to feel love for a pen pal, Then that's what happened with us. I matched with a girl on Tinder who just so happened to be a rep in our store every now and then. We ended up chatting a little, then met at a club we both happened to be going to. We danced for a bit and then went to walk to another club but got sidetracked and went to a park instead. I was in a toga and it was like 3 degrees that night, so we ended up cuddling and talking. She's been through some fricked up crap, so I just listened for hours and ended up telling her about the time I tried to kill myself, which I've never told anyone before. She was so understanding. It really helped me. She did her best to keep me warm as we laid down on the grass, and eventually we went back to my place and went to bed. The next day we just got high and chilled, cuddling on the couch and watching dumb crap on TV. We did end up hooking up, but dang if that wasn't the first time I've had such a truly deep and spiritual connection with someone. Sitting in comfortable silence with my boyfriend while he plays computer games and I watch Netflix on my phone. It's such a lovely feeling to be close to someone where you can just be yourself and do whatever you want to do, but together. It's good to know my wife and I aren't the only ones who do this. I was once alone in an elevator in my dorm building, and I arrived at my floor, pretty high up, and not a lot of people living there at the time. I pretended to open the doors with the force. The doors opened to reveal a girl on the other side doing the exact same thing. We didn't say anything to each other, but we made eye contact and smiled, and it's the purest form of human connection I've ever experienced. That's freaking amazing. I recovered a crashed C-130 with a friend and we had a body come apart at the waist when we picked it up and spew bile everywhere. He broke down crying, so we sat in the JP8 soaked soil and hugged it out for a while with our gas mask on a foot from the body. I was in Europe sitting down at a cafe. I see this beautiful woman walk by. As my head turned to watch her walk past, I notice out of the corner of my eye some other guy doing the same thing. Then he realized that I had caught him looking at this amazing woman and I realized that he had caught me. There was at least 30 years between us. We both smiled at each other, big, dumb grins. It's nice to know there can be simple pleasures in life between strangers. One time I saw this girl with an incredible butt and couldn't help but stare as I walked by. When I finally looked forward, I made eye contact with this dude who himself had just looked over from said girl's butt. He smiled and shook his head at me in approval as if he was saying, "Dang straight, that's a good one." It made my day. I pulled up to a red light, waiting to make a left turn. I'm listening to the radio pretty loud. I look over to my right and see this pretty cute girl. We lock eyes and both realize that we are listening to the same song. Cue the next 10-15 seconds of full-on air guitar and drums rocking out together until the light turned green. Then we went our separate ways. I had a huge grin on my face for the rest of the drive. It lasted a whole of about 5 seconds. A girl got off the elevator, strapped into a wheelchair. Her arms were cut up and she had just finished crying. I was new at the hospital, maybe my 3rd day at the time. She looked at me, I looked at her. Never in my life will I ever forget the pain, sadness and agony she held in her bloodshot eyes. Not sure where she is now, or if she's even alive, but for those few short seconds it felt like her world had flooded into me. My older sister and I are 8 years apart. We weren't super close growing up because by the time I was able to actually start connecting with her on a deeper level, she was in college. She's always had my back though and has never failed me. Anytime I have fricked up, I call her because odds are she has always done the exact same thing but 100 times worse and gotten out of it. She's the coolest older sister. Anyway, a couple years ago my nephew, not my sister's child, was diagnosed with cancer. He passed away earlier this year at the age of 7. He was in hospice and in extremely rough shape. Neither of my parents wanted to see him in this stage and had gotten the chance to say goodbye before this point. My older sister and I both lived in different states, and when the news came to us that he was officially in hospice, we knew we had to see him. We drove 4 hours together, keeping each other's spirits up by rapping to each other and talking about bad dating experiences. This lasted until we made it to our brother's house. We both knew we weren't able to see my nephew yet, so we went outside and drank a beer with family. Finally we felt ready, held each other's hands, and went inside to see him. He hardly looked alive. There was a moment of panic as we both made sure he was still breathing. He was asleep and we didn't want to wake him, so we just held hands and cried. We did get to talk to him the next morning, and I will treasure the moments I spent with him and her for as long as I'll live and for whatever comes after. But we left later that afternoon and it was one of the worst days of my life having to say goodbye to him. I always thought I would get to see him grow up. He passed away the day after we left. For the car ride home, my sister knew I wouldn't be able to drive and immediately took the driver's seat. We cried the whole way back, drinking crappy gas station coffee and listening to sad music. She rolled down the windows and we screamed frick this at the top of our lungs together. I would not have been able to make that trip alone. I will always be grateful for her presence in those horrible moments. There are just some things you can't connect with others about. She is one of the only people to share the horror of losing our nephew and also the bliss that was knowing him. That's beautiful and painful. Good sis. The usual. Mobile, etc. About a decade ago I was dumped after 3 years by first real boyfriend. He was the first for many things, if you know what I mean. I was at my parents' house alone except for my older brother who was sleeping because he worked nights. I just sat on the couch crying. No TV, nothing, just sat and cried. Around noon I hear my brother come down the stairs and go to the kitchen. I do nothing and keep crying. About 15 minutes later my brother comes back carrying a folding table. He had made me a giant BLT sandwich and brought me a big glass of water with ice. Then he just sat on the couch with me for hours. Didn't say anything but still stayed. He's not a touchy-feely person. Doesn't talk about feelings and sleep is his favorite thing. I appreciated him so much in that moment. It was his way of taking care of my heartache and to this day it still sticks with me. Maybe it's silly but it meant a lot to me and I consider one of our few moments where we had an emotional connection. Your brother is awesome. Family is precious. With my daughter, when they placed her on my chest and she recognized my voice, those big, blue eyes staring straight into mine. Never experienced anything like it before and it was that moment that I felt so connected to her. She was mine. I was hers. We just had our first child in December. This summarizes it perfectly. I've never experienced something so mind-blowing and life-changing. All coming from a little 6 pounds 7 ounces baby girl sticking her tongue out while laying on my wife's chest. Met a guy through couch surfing while I was in New York and ended up having dinner at his place a few days later. We got a little drunk and talked about life, the universe, and our many fears frustrations into the early hours of the morning. It was an almost transcendental experience. I'm a man myself, and I love it when two guys can just get together and talk. You know, nowadays, you can't really get away with that kind of thing without being called gay. I was hosting a party with friends. It was pretty chill. There were a few friends of friends. One such I didn't know her at all. She got the call her mom had been killed in a hit and run. Her parents lived 1,000 miles away. It was the middle of the night. Everyone else was too drunk to drive. I took her alone on the 2-hour journey to the nearest airport. I hate awkward silences, so I made every attempt at awkward conversation I could. Weather, sports teams, jobs. I spent way too long talking without a response. She barely responded the whole time. We got to the airport, she ran out of the car, didn't say goodbye or anything. I drove home alone. Got home in time to see the sunrise. Had a beer and tried to put it out of my mind. 3 weeks later she messages me on FB. She thanked me for the ride and said she found it comforting to hear someone just talk about the boring things. She said I was exactly the kind of grown-up she needed just then. Years later I still don't feel like an adult, but it's nice to know I have the potential. This just happened to me this weekend. I'm traveling throughout Europe right now and I have a friend living in Amsterdam. We went to school together back in the 2nd grade in Brazil. We then both moved out of Brazil and lost contact. I found her on Instagram and chatted a bit, but nothing big. In the last 12 years we have met only once for about 4 hours. This time when I came to Europe I asked her to hang out and she let me stay over at her place. We went to a music festival a couple days ago with her friends, and in the middle of that place we had one of the best heart-to-heart conversation about our lives back in Brazil. After that and the future, it feels like a simple conversation took a casual friendship into something that will last forever. My Star Wars RPG group. I'm a dungeon game master for my friends. We play Star Wars Force and Destiny Edge of the Empire. It started as an idea with my best friend. We started to invite people who were loners. We frequent a lot of game shops. People that we saw regularly started to come out of their shells. One girl now always bakes for the group. Some of them weren't into Star Wars. Now they've seen the movies and read the lore and love it. Our group of 3 turned into 8. There was a lot of time spent reading and discussing mechanics and theory crafting at Panera Bread with my friend. I realize now that Friday night will probably be our last session for a long time as I leave for basic training in 2 weeks. I can really relate to this. A few years ago I got into D&D and was completely obsessed with it. We played a few campaigns from a universe called Cthulhu. I immediately felt close to the other players, and after about a year of playing every week, I was leaving for 18 months to live in Brazil, and the last run I did was one of the best moments of my life. I've had a lot of heartfelt conversations with people who think they might not be straight, since I'm a gay man who's very open about all types of gender and sexuality. Almost all of them get pretty deep, and the moment when they realize who they actually are is always really intimate, especially since I'm probably one of the only few people who get to actually see that. Must be an amazing experience. I've always felt sorry for people who seem to struggle so much with their sexuality. I hope we can all learn to be more accepting in the future. I had a mental breakdown and a really bad headache outside my mosque one time, and one of my really close friends left, grabbed Advil, and just sat with me in his car the whole time. We didn't talk, but we were just there. A few years ago when I was in high school, when I was invited to my friend's party to celebrate our grad. At the time my life was not in the best place, and I was holding on to a lot of things, and fighting with many demons. Needless to say, the atmosphere, and my wandering thoughts were all too much, and I broke down right there. My friend, who I am still close to today, comforted me. It was as exposed as I've ever been in front of anyone, and hope to ever be again. I met this guy, Blake, playing Call of Duty on Xbox Live 5-6 years back. We would play together almost every day, knew a lot about each other because we talked all the time. We exchanged cell phone numbers and were friends on Facebook. My parents always thought my friendship with him was weird. We were only a year apart in age, but we lived on opposite ends of the country and they thought I should be hanging out with other kids from school rather than staying up late to talk to Blake. I moved away to go to college and we lost contact a little bit. I couldn't bring my Xbox with me or anything, but we would still text sometimes. I flew home one weekend to be with my dad because he had cancer. About 10 minutes after I got home, my dad died. I got on Xbox Live the next morning and Blake invited me to a party. He knew my dad was sick and I told him that he passed away. We didn't play any games that morning, but he stayed in a party with me for a couple of hours. We just talked. We didn't stay in contact much longer. It became more difficult to do as we moved on with our lives. I'll always remember Blake, though. At the time, he was the best friend I could have possibly had. I think about him every time I'm at the cemetery or if I'm discussing my father's death. I hope he felt he had as much of a connection with me as I felt with him. I also hope I was able to positively affect his life in some way and he remembers me fondly. Sorry, this is mostly sap, but I've never talked too much about Blake with anyone. No reason for him to come up. 16-year-old straight male kissless virgin here. For the past few months, I've been helping my best friend, let's call her A, with her issues with depression, anxiety, self-harm, and other things. She had been pretty open about the fact that she was in love with me. I felt the same way, but I didn't tell her because I didn't want to go to sleep every night wondering if my girlfriend would be alive the next morning. One time, about 3 months ago, we were making a strudel at her house for a German project, and she gave me a hug when I put a layer of phyllo dough onto the baking sheet without help. Hooray. Except neither of us let go, and we stood there silently holding each other for a few minutes, and we sorta forgot about the strudel. I wanted to kiss her, but I pussied out. Now she's dating my best friend, and I recently had an anxiety attack over her. I told her about that story, and she said that she loves her current boyfriend, but that I should have kissed her. TL. DR. Girl and I were in love. I missed an opportunity to kiss her. Now she's dating my best friend and I regret everything. Oh boy, that's rough, ain't it? My wife convinced me to go back to school to become a sound engineer because she knew I wasn't happy in the career I had fallen into, healthcare administration. If you're curious, and I had always loved music. At the school I learned there was a rock ensemble group that puts on regular performances. She encouraged me to try out and then encouraged me to join a band that was forming within their ranks. The band got a lot of attention and the school decided to record our debut EP and throw a huge party for our release. The connected moment came when I was standing backstage waiting to go on. This was the first time I had ever played for an audience and it was a sold out show. The venue only sat about 200, but to go from 0 to 200 is a pretty big jump. I thought to myself, why am I not nervous, and looked over at my wife. She was wringing her hands, scanning the audience, biting her lip. She was a wreck. In that moment it suddenly dawned on me that she had been worrying for me the entire time. My parents died when I was young, so I had never experienced this. No one had ever cared enough about me to help carry my emotional burdens. I grabbed her and said, "Hey, I got this," and kissed her. Then I walked onto the stage and lit that crap on fire. My band just got nominated for an award and she's still the best wife I've ever had. There are honestly dozens of non-sexual moments where we have connected, but that's just the top of my list. I freaking love my wife. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.